everyone. I hope you're doing well today. I want to talk a little bit about perfectionism because I am in the process of actually selling my house. And I've just started this process. And I don't know if you know anything about doing that, but it requires a tremendous amount of perfection and sort of meticulous attention to detail, which, to be fair, is a specialty of mine. I'm not actually bad at that. I have always had a very strong controller. And while I can't claim to have specifically OCD, I have always leaned towards making things as perfect as humanly possible. But at the same time, I also understand that this is a very natural response on the part of my controller. And I want to talk about the trauma side of perfectionism today a little bit, because I've noticed what my perfectionism has been doing to me over this last week. And I just kind of want to talk a little bit about what's going on, psychologically speaking, when we have a tendency towards perfectionism. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. I have several points I really want to make today about perfectionism, and please feel free to also comment, join in. I'd love to hear what you have to say about it, because I think it is probably one of the most popular and common and maybe more obvious of the survival skills that we may deal with in our lives. And honestly, it impacts us a lot. It impacts us more than we think it does. So I want to stress that as well. And as I mentioned a minute ago, it is typically the controller who has a tendency towards perfectionism. So that's going to be the part who is active when we are trying to be perfect, when we are paying attention to every little teeny tiny detail. That's going to be a controller behavior. So it's good to know kind of what part you're dealing with when that is going on. And I want to talk about just what are some of the facts around it. What are facts around how it works, what it does, and where it comes from, so that we can understand it better. Because the better we understand perfectionism, the better we're going to be at just kind of balancing it out a little bit. And I'll talk a little bit more about that and the necessity to balance it out and what we balance it out with, right? But if we don't really understand where it's coming from and what part's driving it and why, it can be very difficult to get it under control, I guess you can say, which is ironic because the controller is actually using perfectionism as a way of being in control. So let's talk a little bit about where perfectionism comes from. That to me is very important. Perfectionism is a shame response. Okay. So perfectionism is the controller responding to the self-shaming behavior of the karma kid, okay? And by the way, I want to say that there's almost no survival skill at all that isn't coming from another part. So basically, when one inner part is acting up, bringing a new survival skill to the scene, they are generally doing that because there is another part that's active right under the surface that is provoking to some degree, right? Provoking that part to become that active. And when it comes to the controller's tendencies, survival skill tendencies, a lot of them are actually provoked by the karma kid's self-shaming, actually more than you might think in the scheme of things. Let's see. Byron is saying everything is imperfect, improvement is infinite, but there is such a thing as good enough %. And that is ultimately where we're trying to get, but we can't get there by rejecting the perfectionist trait within us. We actually have to embrace it, hear from it, write from it, learn about it, so that we can figure out where it's coming from and why. So in this case, the karma kid is self-shaming, so the controller is bringing in a really fierce survival skill in the form of perfectionism. But yes, there is no perfect. That's not a thing. That doesn't exist. There is a good enough. That definitely exists, and we can get there. But I will also say that good enough is often not as extreme as we even think that is. So The controller has a tendency to get worse with perfectionism when the karma kid is particularly active. So when they are shaming us, and the controller's goal, of course, is to prove the self-shaming wrong, right? So if I can be perfect enough, that shame that I'm hearing under the surface has to be wrong. It has to be untrue, right? So that's what the controller's trying to do here. They're like, if I can get this stuff perfect enough, if I can get it to a level where I just, ascend to a different level in this world, like I am just so much better as a person, I have accomplished something that no one else could accomplish, then the self-shaming would have to stop, because it could not be true in those circumstances, and it can be almost anything. Like in my case, with having to get the house ready for this sale, it's my karma kid is in the background saying things like, that'll never work. It'll never happen. Nobody will want it. You're not good enough. You don't have a nice enough house. You're not allowed to have a nice enough house. Nobody's going to want it. You're bad at this. You're bad at that. You're bad at this. You're bad at that. Back and forth, right? This is what karma kids do. And the controller is on the surface going, no way. I can prove the karma kid wrong. I can do everything so amazingly that this will be the best house that has ever been put on the market ever in the entirety of houses, right? Again, both things are very wrong. Both things, the shame is just a blatant lie, but the perfectionism is actually impossible to achieve, right? So in both cases, we're kind of pushing back and forth between two things that are just not reality. I'm not going to have the best house ever to be put on the market, but also I am a good person and I can have really nice things. And I'm not the best interior designer, but I'm not awful. So it's about finding that place in the middle. But boy, that's a tough one when those two parts start battling it out with each other. That is really, really difficult to find that balance between them, because they're both very strong and they're both very intense, right? So the next thing I want to talk about in regards to perfectionism is maybe the most obvious, which is that perfectionism will run us into the ground. I mean, it will quite literally use up all of our energy and make our energy unavailable for anything else, okay? And I remember back in the old days before I started healing, which I will say that my behavior this last week has felt a little bit like that. I used to go to bed at night feeling like I had just run a marathon because I spent the entire day attempting to make everything perfect. Now, I don't do that anymore. It isn't that I do it with everything, but I can definitely feel the intense controller coming in around this particular thing right now, and making it feel like it has got to be perfect, and it's exhausting. And I can also hear the parts in my system who want to rest, who really desperately want to rest. And that has just not been available to them in the way that I typically like to do it from a balanced perspective. So the rest has not been available because the controller is driving me into the ground with the lack of balance, because everything has to be perfect to prove that karma kid shaming wrong, right? So you get really tired when you're actively being perfectionistic, right? Okay. The next thing I want to mention about perfectionism is that perfectionism is highly conforming in nature. So you can't say that perfectionism is subjective, right? Because perfectionism is not actually a real thing. And that would be true. But to a degree, perfectionism is going to base itself on societal values, right? Cultural pressures, the way that we are supposed to be, the way that we are supposed to act. There's a lot of conforming that happens when we move into perfectionism, because what we're really trying to be perfect to is a particular standard. Some kind of standard that's been set by somebody, by something. It may be a bit unclear as to what that is, but there's a standard and we're trying to conform to it. What that generally means is there isn't any room really for creativity or uniqueness. That stuff kind of goes out the window. We're just looking to meet some kind of social or cultural standard that has been set. So, in a sense, there's a level of perfectionism that is not subjective because we know what it looks like. We know what the advertisements say. We know what the magazines look like. We know what social media says it is supposed to look like. And so that piece of it is a very conforming process. Um, but that generally means we're not going to be very connected to that intuitive part of us that, may have some creativity or uniqueness to provide to the situation. And sometimes, especially in the situation I'm in, some of that uniqueness or creativity is actually not a bad idea, but it's very hard to reach that when we are so significantly tied into this conforming perfectionism of the controller in particular. So the next one, so this is number 4, if you're counting, is that perfectionism is a fear response. We are trying to be perfect because we are afraid of what will happen if we aren't. Now, some of that is going to be coming from the shame, right? So if the shame is right, that's a very bad thing, right? Now, the controller does actually believe the shame may be right, but they also believe that they can fight against that shame and they can win, right? So this is, by the way, exhausting because you're literally trying to prove yourself wrong when you're in this place where the right answer is really working with the shame, writing from the shame, helping the shame to heal, releasing the shame so that you don't have it anymore. Because then the control, and what you'll see is the controller will then feel less intensely committed to these kind of survival skills because the shame is not there, so it's not having to battle against the shame. But when the shame is there, the controller gets quite active and intense. And one of the reasons is because if the shame is right, bad things are gonna happen. Generally speaking, that's how the controller sees this. So the perfectionism is a survival skill that is actually meant to stop bad things from happening. I find this can be really helpful for us, especially when we're trying to work with our inner parts, okay, is to understand that perfectionism does have a very, very strong fear-based component to it, okay? So when we can understand that perfectionism is coming from fear, it can actually help us to have a bit more compassion for ourselves when we're in that place. Now, it doesn't necessarily help us to have compassion for the poor parts that are like, can I please rest? But oftentimes I find that if we can have compassion for the part that's shaming, compassion for the part that's very scared of that shame being right, so they feel the need to be perfect, that then will allow us a little bit of room, a little bit of wiggle room to have compassion for the parts that actually really want to rest. And who knows, maybe they wanted to rest your entire lives, right? That is a thing. That is real. Byron is saying, fighting my own instinct to conform is a difficult one. Look, again, speaking of the fear, right? The fear drives our need to conform, and the fear drives our need to do it in a perfect way. These are very deeply connected to each other. If we conform, we are safe. That's what we've been taught. We've been taught this most of our lives. We've been taught that if we just look like, act like, think like, right? Those around us will be okay. There's a very tribal instinct associated with that. But to be fair, in the most modern of societies, we are taught this. We are always being taught not to stand out, right? And then we get to adulthood and we're like, oh, I really want to stand out. But there's so much brainwashing that gets caught up in, like, it stops us in our tracks, really, from being able to let ourselves be less conforming, right? So yeah, That's a very difficult one. What I suggest when you're feeling pressure to conform is that you work with the fears that say you have to, right? So pushing to right from the parts that are saying, I must do what the world thinks I must do here, right? I must do what needs to be done according to society or culture or country or neighborhood or family, whatever it is, I must do that right from those parts who think they have to, because that will direct you towards the fears. And it is those fears that, as long as they're in place, right, we're always going to be doing what we think will keep us safe instead of what we think, like what is really true to us, what our heart really wants, right? So letting yourself work with those fears is incredibly powerful for our healing. So the next one I have, and this is also very much sign of the controller in general. Perfectionism is a moving goalpost. So, what do I mean when I say moving goalpost? What that basically means is that when you achieve one level of perfectionism, you are then going to be moved to a new goal, right? A new goalpost where the perfectionism takes it up a notch. So, the controller uses this process to keep us out of the present moment. Okay. They don't want us present. They don't want us centered in the now, because if we're centered in the now, we're going to connect with ourselves. And that means connecting with the emotions that we feel. So the controller is very opposed to the idea of being present. That is not their thing. They don't want to do it. The best way the controller has found to keep us from being in the present moment is to always be focused on what is wrong in the present moment that we need to fix to make the present moment perfect. That's a huge strategy for the controller. If you're sitting and enjoying an experience, the controller will be looking for a way to distract you from the moment with something that needs to change in order to make it better. This is classic controller. Honestly, some of the most important controller stuff that there is. Like, we do want to be focused on how the controller does this to us. Because the truth is, we've been telling ourselves our whole life that everything will be better once something happens. Now, at first, our family told us this. Now we have taken that baton and now we're running with it, right? We're running with that same strategy that our family used on us. So now we're telling ourselves, as soon as we get to X, things will be better. And as soon as we get to Y, things will be better. And then as soon as we get to Z, things will be better. And as long as we're always sort of pushing for the next future goalpost, we aren't truly able to be here in this moment. Okay, that's a strategy, and that really is one of the most powerful strategies of the controller. And it does, and it works. It works for years and years. It worked for me. And I will say that over this last week, it has worked again. I've been really in the controller quite a bit, but it's a big one. It's a big one, and we have to be aware of it. And we have to see when we're doing that to ourselves, because we will pull ourselves out of the present moment, out of the body, out of our emotions, and we will exhaust ourselves while we are doing this. And that's the controller in action. I want to see Janice saying, I relate to everything you are saying. I try to practice planning and trying to let go. Try and let things happen rather than feeling pressure to have it be perfect. Live my life with perfectionism. Great ideas here how to address. So enlightening. Yes, Jan, I have a feeling you and I lived very similarly. I really found myself sort of stepping back into that this last week. And for a lot of very good reasons. I'm not chastising my controller. I see the fear in them. I see where they're coming from. I know why they do what they do. But I also know that what I did this last week is totally and completely unsustainable. It isn't something I plan to continue. It's not feasible to do this all the time. But I will say that when people have a lot of trauma and a very strong part system that has a lot of fear in it, they'll try to live this way permanently. And I can tell you, it isn't possible. That is not sustainable. If nothing else, you'll get sick, really sick, if you do it for long enough. So we want to start to move some of these behaviors out and find a balance between the controller's need to get everything just right for survival purposes and the rest of our system that generally does need to be able to sit and rest and be present and process their feelings. And finding that balance is a big part of our journey. That means writing. I know you're not surprised to hear me say that. That means writing is a big part of this. We need to write from the controller's fears, and we need to write from the parts that are only available to us when we stop running between those goalposts, right? So keep writing, keep working on finding this balance, and understanding where perfectionism comes from is a huge part of finding that balance. So I hope you found this very helpful today. I'm really happy that my voice held up and that I didn't cough all the way through this because I'm not totally better, but I thought I would risk it today. And I'm glad that I did. So thank you all so much for being here with me today. And I look forward to talking to you again next week, same time, same place, as long as all the technical stuff and all of my physical stuff work out. We will be able to go back to our normal live streaming schedule. So thank you all so much. And I will talk to you all very soon.